The entities of Olympus left order and beauty in their sacrifices and their temples. The mad women, the Manads, had no temples. They went to the wilderness to worship, to the wildest mountains, the deepest forests, as if they kept to the customs of an ancient time before men had thought of building houses for whom they considered to be their gods. They went out of the dusty, crowded city, back to the lean purity of the untrodden hills and woodlands. There Dionysus gave them food and drink, herbs and berries, and the milk of the wild goat. Their beds were on the soft meadow grass, under the thick-leaved trees, where the pine needles fall year after year. They woke to a sense of peace and heavenly freshness. They bathed in a clear brook. There was much that was lovely, good, and freeing in this worship under the open sky, and the ecstasy of joy it brought, and the wild beauty of the world. And yet always present, too, was the horribly bloody feast, the worship of Dionysus was centered in these two ideas so far apart of freedom and ecstatic joy and of savage brutality. The entity of wine could give either to his worshippers. Throughout the story of his life, he is sometimes man's blessing, sometimes his ruin. Of all the terrible deeds laid to his account, the worst was done in Thebes, his mother's city. Dionysus came to Thebes to establish his worship there. He was accompanied, as was his custom, by a train of women dancing and singing exultant songs, wearing fawn skins over their robes, waving ivy-wreathed wands. They seemed mad with joy. They sang, "O Bacchanals, come! O come! Sing Dionysus! Sing to the timbrel, the deep-voiced timbrel! Joyfully praise him, him who brings joy! Holy, all holy, music is calling to the hills, to the hills! Fly, O Bacchanal! Swift of foot, on, O joyful! Be fleet!" Pentheus, the king of Thebes, was the son of Semele's sister, but he had no idea that the leader of this band of excited, strange-acting women was his own cousin. He did not know that when Semele died, Zeus saved her child. The wild dancing and the loud, joyous singing and the generally queer behavior of these strangers seemed to him highly objectionable and to be stopped at once. Pentheus ordered his guards to seize and imprison the visitors, especially the leader, whose face is flushed with wine, a cheating sorcerer from Lydia. But as he said these words, he heard behind him a solemn warning. The man you reject is a new god. He is Semele's child, whom Zeus rescued. He, with divine Demeter, is greatest upon earth for men. The speaker was the old blind prophet, Tiresias, the holy man of Thebes, who knew that no one else, he knew as no one else, the will of whom were to be considered gods. But as Pentheus turned to answer him, he saw that he was tricked out like the wild women, a wreath of ivy on his white hair, his old shoulders covered by fawn skin, a queer pine-tipped stick in his trembling hand. Pentheus laughed mockingly as he looked him over, and then ordered him with contempt out of his sight. Thus he brought upon himself the doom he would not hear when the entities spoke to him. Dionysus was led in before him by a band of his soldiers. They said he had not tried to flee or to resist, but had done all possible to make it easy for them to seize and bring him until they felt ashamed and told him they were acting under orders, not of their own free will. They declared, too, that the maidens they had imprisoned had all escaped to the mountains. The fetters would not keep fastened, the doors unbarred themselves. This man, they said, has come to Thebes with many wonders. Pentheus by now was blind to everything except his anger and his scorn. He spoke roughly to Dionysus, who answered him with entire gentleness, seemed to try to reach his real self and open his eyes to see that he was face to face with what he considered to be divinity. He warned him that he could not keep him in prison, for God will set me free. God? Pentheus asked jeeringly. Yes, Dionysus answered. He is here and sees my suffering, not where my eyes can see him, Pentheus said. He is where I am, answered Dionysus. You cannot see him, for you are not pure. Pentheus angrily ordered the soldiers to bind him and take him to the prison, and Dionysus went, saying, The wrongs you do to me are wrongs done to whom we consider to be gods. But the prison could not hold Dionysus. He came forth, and going to Pentheus again, he tried to persuade him to yield to what these wonders plainly showed was what they considered to be divine, and welcome this new worship of a new and great God. When, however, Pentheus only heaped insults and threats upon him, Dionysus left him to his doom, and it was the most horrible there could be. Remember in the Bible how Jesus is said to have escaped being killed by divine favor? Yeah, the Bible claims crucifixion in a contradictory sort of way, but that wasn't the first attempt to do away with him. Pentheus went to pursue the entity's followers among the hills where the maidens had fled when they escaped from prison. Many of the Theban women joined them. Pentheus's mother and her sisters were there, and there Dionysus showed himself in his most terrible aspect. He made them all mad. The women thought Pentheus a wild beast, a mountain lion, and they rushed to destroy him. His mother first. As they fell upon him, he knew at last that he had fought against what was considered to be a god, and must pay with his life. They tore him limb from limb, and then, only then, the entity restored their senses, and his mother saw what she had done. Looking at her in agony, the maidens, all sobered now, the dancing over, and the singing, and the wild wand waving, said one to another, In strange ways hard to know, gods, in strange ways hard to know, gods come to men. Many a thing past hope they had fulfilled, and what was looked for went another way. A path we never thought to tread God found for us. So has this come to pass. And I think there's dots here, so I'm guessing that there's something omitted from the first printing. The ideas about Dionysus in these various stories seemed at first sight contradictory. In one, he's the joy entity, he whose locks are bound with gold, ruddy Bacchus, comrade of the Maenads, whose blithe torch blazes. In another, He is the heartless entity, savage, brutal. He who, with a mocking laugh, hunts his prey, snares and drags him to his death with his bacchanals. The truth is, however, that both ideas arose quite simply and reasonably from the fact of his being the entity of wine. Wine is bad as well as good. It cheers and warms men's hearts. It also makes them drunk. The Greeks were a people who saw facts clearly. They could not shut their eyes to the ugly and degrading side of wine drinking and see only the delightful side. Dionysus was considered to be god of the vine. Therefore, he was a power which sometimes made men commit frightful and atrocious crimes. No one could defend them. No one would ever try to defend the fate Pentheus suffered. But the Greeks said to each other, such things really do happen when people are frenzied with drink. This truth did not blind them to the other truth, that wine was the merrymaker, lightening men's hearts, bringing careless ease and fun and gaiety. I've never consumed an alcoholic beverage in my life. The fact that even an ounce of alcohol within beer in a 24-hour period, not even all at once, but in a 24-hour period, results in brain damage. It's kind of enough worldly reason, despite other reasons, enough worldly reason for me to kind of not take part in that. The wine of Dionysus, when the weary cares of men leave every heart, we travel to a land that never was. The poor grow rich, the rich grow great of heart. All conquering are the shafts made from the vine. The reason that Dionysus was so different at one time from another was because of this double nature of wine, and so of the entity of wine. He was man's benefactor, and he was man's destroyer. On his beneficent side, he was not only the entity that makes men merry, his cup was life-giving, healing every ill. Well, there is nutrition and other stuff related to the plants that you make alcoholic beverages with, but they don't have to be booze to do that. Under his influence, courage was quickened and fear banished. At any rate, for the moment, he uplifted his worshippers. He made them feel that they could do what they had thought they could not. All this happy freedom and confidence passed away, of course, as they either grew sober or got drunk, but while it lasted, it was like being possessed by a power greater than themselves. So people felt about Dionysus as about no other entity. He was not only outside of them, he was within them too. The whole God is in me and I am in God thing, but a little more connected to the creation than in monotheism. They could be transformed by him into being like him. The momentary sense of exultant power wine drinking gave was only a sign to show men that they had within them more than they knew. They could themselves become divine. Or so they thought. To think in this way was far removed from the old idea of worshipping the entity by drinking enough to be joyous, or to be freed from care, or to get drunk. There were followers of Dionysus who never drank wine at all. It is not known when the great change took place, lifting the entity who freed men for a moment through drunkenness to the entity who freed them through inspiration. But one very remarkable result of it made Dionysus, for all future ages, the most important of the entities of Greece. And the thing about sorcery is it's not just find some drug or the right combination of drugs to get high. It's an add-on. It's an enhancement of the ritual. It's not that most of the experience can still be through the ritual. The Eleusinian mysteries, which were always chiefly Demeter's, had indeed great importance. For hundreds of years they helped men, as Cicero said, to live with joy and to die with hope. But their influence did not last, very unlikely because nobody was allowed to teach their ideas openly or write about them. In the end, only a dim memory of them was left. It was quite otherwise with Dionysus. What was done at his great festival was open to all in the world and is a living influence today. No other festival in Greece could compare with it. It took place in the spring when the vine begins to put forth its branches, and it lasted for 5 days. They were days of perfect peace and enjoyment. All the ordinary business of life stopped. No one could be put in prison. Prisoners were even released so that they could share in the general rejoicing. But the place where people gathered to do honor to the entity was not a wild wilderness made horrible by savage deeds and a bloody feast. It was not even a temple precinct with ordered sacrifices and priestly ceremonies. It was a theater, and the ceremony was the performance of a play. The greatest poetry in Greece, and among the greatest in the world, was written for Dionysus. The poets who wrote the plays, the actors and singers who took part in them, were all regarded as servants of the entity. The performances were sacred. The spectators, too, along with the writers and the performers, were engaged in an act of worship. Dionysus himself was supposed to be present. His priest had the seat of honor. It is clear, therefore, that the idea of the entity of holy inspiration who could fill men with his spirit to write gloriously and to act gloriously became far more important than the earlier ideas of him. The first tragic plays, which are among the best there are, never equaled, except by Shakespeare, were produced in the theater of Dionysus. Comedies were produced there too, but tragedies far outnumbered them, and there was a reason why. This strange entity, the gay reveler, the cruel hunter, the lofty inspirer, was also the sufferer. He, like Demeter, was afflicted, not because of grief for another, as she was, but because of his own pain. He was the vine which is always pruned as nothing else that bears fruits. Every branch cut away, only the bare stalk left. Through the winter, a dead thing to look at, an old gnarled stump, seeming incapable of ever putting forth leaves again. Like Persephone, Dionysus died with the coming of the cold. Unlike her, his death was terrible. He was torn to pieces, in some stories by the Titans, in others by Hera's orders. He was always brought back to life. He died and rose again. It was his joyful resurrection they celebrated in his theater. But the idea of terrible deeds done to him and done by men under his influence was too closely associated with him ever to be forgotten. He was more than what they considered to be the suffering god. He was considered to be the tragic god. There was none other. There's not as many correlations between the type of figure that Jesus was portrayed as here, but some of the stuff, Dionysus, Bacchus, it's far more in line with the biblical Jesus idea than people are usually ready to admit. He had still another side. He was the assurance that death does not end all. His worshippers believed that his death and resurrection showed that the soul lives on forever after the body dies. This faith was part of the mysteries of Eleusis. At first, it centered in Persephone, who also rose from the dead every spring, but as queen of the black underworld, she kept even in the bright world above a suggestion of something strange and awful. How could she, who carried always about her the reminder of death, stand for the resurrection and the conquest of death? Dionysus, on the contrary, was never thought of as a power in the kingdom of the dead. There are many stories about Persephone in the lower world. Only one about Dionysus. He rescued his mother from it. In his resurrection, he was the embodiment of the life that is stronger than death. He, and not Persephone, became the center of the belief in immortality. Around the year 80 of the Common Era, a Greek writer, Plutarch, received news when he was far from home that a little daughter of his had died, a child of most gentle nature. He says in his letter to his wife, he writes, "About that which you have heard, dear heart, that the soul, once departed from the body, vanishes and feels nothing. I know that you give no belief to such assertions because of those sacred and faithful promises given in the mysteries of Bacchus, which we who are of that religious brotherhood know. We hold it firmly for an undoubted truth that our soul is incorruptible and immortal. We are to think of the dead that they pass into a better place and a happier condition. Let us behave ourselves accordingly, outwardly ordering our lives well. Within, all should be purer, wiser, incorruptible." And see, Plutarch and some of the big thinkers of the time where Christianity was thought to have been getting big didn't seem to know about them, at least not in the way the Christians were portraying, maybe a minor figure here and there. But we also see in the Greece thing, a more fluid than the Judeo-Christian tradition, although there's so many changes in both of those throughout the ages to whole types of each type of religion fading away into history. At the point of even not being distinguishable by the remnants. But just like Carol Pochranian's retelling of the tale of Akkad, they tried to retell the stories to relate more to humans or to have more of an effect. And so to most mythological systems, it wasn't about keeping a purity of the tradition, except maybe some of the initiations, but having more an effect, getting more across.